At 5:50 in the morning, on June 6, 1944, the battleship United States ship Texas trained her 10 14-inch guns on the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc and opened fire. Each shell weighed nearly 1,400 pounds. Each one crossed more than 4 miles of cold grey English Channel before striking the chalk headland above the beaches of Normandy. The first round tore a crater into the cliff top wide enough to swallow a house. The second collapsed a concrete ammunition store that German engineers had spent months building. Inside the bunkers of Coastal Artillery Regiment 1260, men pressed their faces against reinforced concrete walls and discovered something their training had never prepared them for. The walls were shaking. To the east, the 15-inch guns of the British battleship His Majesty's ship Warspite were walking fire across the German positions above the beaches codenamed Golden Sword. The cruiser His Majesty's ship Ajax had opened a counter-battery duel with the concrete casemates at Longtime, trading salvos at close range in the grey pre-dawn light. The battleship United States ship Nevada, raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor nearly 2.5 years earlier, repaired and refitted and sailed across the Atlantic, was now directing her 10 14-inch guns at the heavy battery at Crisbecq, above the beach the Allies called Utah. The battleship United States ship Arkansas put her 12-inch shells into the bluffs overlooking Omaha. The British battleship His Majesty's ship Ramillies hammered the Benneville battery far to the east. Across more than 50 miles of Norman coastline, Allied warships were firing simultaneously, and the weight of steel they sent into those defences in the hours around dawn exceeded anything the men inside them had ever imagined surviving. In the bunker at Aysville, a German naval officer later said it was like being inside a bell that refused to stop ringing. Some men inside the casemates were found dead with no external wounds at all. The overpressure from shells detonating against the outer walls had torn their lungs inside their chests. Others sat down on ammunition crates, placed their hands over their ears, and simply waited. In the casemates at Longtime, the telephone cables linking the guns to the fire control post had already been severed by Royal Air Force bombing raids the night before, leaving each gun crew to fight without coordination or accurate spotting. At Pointe du Hoc, the men of the garrison had no idea that the 6 heavy howitzers they were supposed to be defending had been moved inland days earlier to protect them from air attack. They were guarding empty concrete casemates while the Texas systematically demolished everything around them. Something extraordinary was happening on that coastline. The greatest fortification system in the history of warfare was coming apart at the seams, and the morning was only beginning. To understand why that system failed, it is necessary first to understand what it was supposed to be. By the spring of 1944, the Atlantic Wall was more than a military construction project. It was the physical expression of Adolf Hitler's belief that Fortress Europe could be made impregnable. The idea had taken shape in the aftermath of the British commando raids of 1942, and it was formalized in Führer Directive No. 40, issued March 23, 1942, ordering the construction of a continuous defensive belt along the occupied coasts of Europe from the North Cape of Norway to the Spanish border. A second directive, No. 51, issued November 3, 1943, designated the West as the decisive theatre and demanded that all construction be accelerated. The organization built to carry out this vision was the organization TOD, the paramilitary construction arm of the Reich, which drew on a labor force of approximately 260,000 workers. Only a small fraction of those workers were German. The rest were Frenchmen conscripted under the Service du Travail Obligatoire, Dutch and Belgian laborers, Soviet prisoners of war, Spanish Republican exiles, and forced workers brought from across occupied Europe. They poured concrete around the clock, in shifts, in all weathers, along a coastline they had no interest in defending. The scale of what they built was staggering. Close to 17 million cubic meters of concrete went into the Atlantic Wall across all occupied territories. More than 1 million tons of steel reinforcing bar was consumed. The defences followed standardized designs called Regelbauten, which came in numbered types according to their function. There were gun casemates, personnel shelters, ammunition bunkers, observation towers, command posts, anti-tank positions, and machine gun nests. The heaviest casemates used walls 3.5 meters thick, designed to withstand the largest naval shells then known. The more common standard used walls of 2 meters. The individual casemates were connected by underground tunnels in many positions, allowing defenders to move between fighting positions under fire. Telephone cables ran underground between strongpoints and command posts. Some positions had their own generators, water supplies, and medical facilities. On the beaches themselves, the defences were layered with careful attention to the mechanics of how an amphibious assault would have to approach. Steel hedgehog obstacles and concrete tetrahedral were planted in the sand and below the waterline to rip open landing craft. Behind them stood wooden poles tipped with mines, which the men who placed them called Rommel's asparagus. Beyond those stretched belts of barbed wire, then minefields, then the concrete strongpoints. On the high ground behind the beaches stood the coastal batteries, their heavy guns oriented to fire along the beaches from the flanks rather than directly out to sea, designed to catch any landing force in enfilading fire from positions that were difficult to engage head-on from warships at sea. Joseph Goebbels ensured the German public understood all of this. Newsreels showed what appeared to be an unbroken ribbon of concrete stretching from the North Sea to the Bay of Biscay, impenetrable and eternal. Hitler called it the rampart of Fortress Europe, and in the spring of 1944, a great many people believed him. But the truth behind the propaganda was more complicated. The wall was thickest and most complete around the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, where German intelligence believed the Allied blow would fall. In Normandy, farther to the west, the defences were thinner, the garrisons older, the concrete in some places not yet fully cured. Of the planned 15,000 permanent structures across the entire wall, only around 8,000 had been completed by June of 1944. The gap between what the newsreels showed and what actually stood on the beaches of Normandy was substantial. Still, what was there was formidable by any normal measure, and the men guarding it believed in it. By the early summer of 1944, the broader strategic position of Nazi Germany was already deeply compromised. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army had recovered from the catastrophes of the early war years and was preparing to launch Operation Bagration, which would begin on June 22, 1944, and destroy Army Group Center in 6 weeks, costing the Wehrmacht more than 300,000 men. That drain of manpower and material had been running continuously for 3 years. Of the hundreds of German divisions still in the field, the overwhelming majority were fighting in the east. In Italy, Rome had fallen to the Allies on June 4th, 2 days before the Normandy landings. Over France and Germany, Allied air power had achieved a dominance the Luftwaffe could no longer meaningfully contest. Since the spring, the Allied transportation plan, overseen by Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, had systematically bombed French railway yards, bridges, and engine sheds across the entire rail network. By the time the landings came, German armoured units trying to reach Normandy as reinforcements would have to move largely at night, along cratered roads, under constant attack from fighter bombers that owned the daytime sky. Fuel was already critically short. The synthetic oil plants that produced the fuel for German aircraft and tanks were under sustained strategic bombing. Into this deteriorating situation, Field Marshal Rommel had arrived with energy and alarm. Hitler had appointed Rommel as Inspector General of Atlantic Defences in November 1943, and in January 1944, Rommel took formal command of Army Group B, which covered the coast from the Netherlands south to the Loire. He toured the wall and was alarmed by what he found: gaps in the defences, incomplete installations, undertrained garrisons manning positions that were not fully stocked with ammunition, obstacles rusting in the surf rather than being maintained and extended. He attacked the problem with the energy that had once driven him across the deserts of Libya and Tunisia. He ordered the laying of millions of additional mines, though by June only around 6 million of a planned 50 million had been placed. He designed and had installed the beach obstacles that Allied planners would call Rommel's asparagus, wooden poles tipped with mines meant to destroy landing craft before they could discharge their troops. He visited position after position along the coast, hectoring commanders, demanding reports, and pushing the work with an urgency that his subordinates sometimes found exhausting. And he spoke, to anyone who would listen, about time. Rommel had seen in North Africa what Allied air power could do to armoured columns moving in daylight on open roads. He believed, with a certainty bordering on desperation, that the panzer divisions held in reserve behind the wall could never move fast enough under Allied air attack to reach the beaches after a landing had begun. They had to be positioned close to the coast already, ready to strike within hours of any Allied landing. He told his aide, Captain Helmuth Lang, on April 22, 1944, that the first 24 hours of the invasion would be decisive. He said the fate of Germany depended on the outcome. He called it the longest day. He meant every word of it. But Rommel's vision placed him in direct and unresolved conflict with his superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West. Von Rundstedt believed the panzers should be held back as a central strategic reserve, committed in mass only once the main Allied point of attack had revealed itself. If the armoured divisions were scattered near the coast, he argued, they would be pinned in place by naval gunfire and air attack before they could concentrate for a decisive counterattack. General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg of Panzer Group West supported this view. Hitler resolved the dispute in the worst possible way. He assigned Rommel the 21st Panzer Division near Caen and the 2nd and 116th Panzer Divisions as Army Group B Reserve, while retaining the most powerful armoured formations under his own direct authority at the Armed Forces High Command. These included the 1st SS Panzer Division, the 12th SS Panzer Division, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, and the Panzer Lehr Division, along with the ISS Panzer Corps headquarters under General Sepp Dietrich. Those formations could not move without Hitler's personal authorization. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and in practice produced the worst outcome of both approaches simultaneously. In the last hours of June 5, 1944, the German defenders along the Normandy coast were, for the most part, at ease. 3 days of heavy Channel storms had battered the coast. German meteorologists had advised their commanders that no major amphibious operation would be possible before the middle of June at the earliest. The storm, in its violence, had paradoxically reassured the defenders. Senior officers of the 7th Army had departed for war games, scheduled in Rennes on the morning of June 6. General Friedrich Dollmann, commander of the 7th Army, had ordered a Kriegsspiel, a map exercise, drawing many of his senior divisional commanders away from their posts on the very night the Allies chose to cross. Rommel himself had driven home to Herrlingen, in Germany, to be with his wife Lucy on her 50th birthday. He carried with him a pair of grey suede shoes he had bought for her in Paris. Von Rundstedt was at his headquarters outside Paris. Neither the commander of Army Group B nor the Commander-in-Chief West was anywhere near the coast when the Allied fleet began its approach in the darkness. In the bunkers and strongpoints along the beaches, the garrison troops followed their evening routines. At Widerstandsnest 62, a reinforced strongpoint overlooking the eastern end of Omaha Beach, a 20-year-old machine gunner named Heinrich Severloh had been called to his post shortly after midnight, when reports of Allied paratroop landings began reaching his unit. He loaded his machine gun and settled in alongside his commanding officer, Lieutenant Bernhard Frerking, and the roughly 40 men of their garrison. The position was manned partly by men of the 716th Static Infantry Division and partly by a detachment of the 352nd Infantry Division. Along the coast toward Utah Beach, the naval artillery officer, Walter Ohmsen, at the Crisbecq battery was already awake, watching through his rangefinder at a dark sea that showed nothing. At Pointe du Hoc, the garrison manned positions around casemates that no longer held the guns their orders described. Major Werner Pluskat, artillery commander of the 352nd Infantry Division, had been woken by the sound of Allied aircraft overhead around 1 a.m. and telephoned his regimental commander, who told him it was probably another bombing raid. Pluskat did not sleep again. He sat at his observation post above the bluffs and watched the dark sea through his binoculars. Slowly, as the night passed, the horizon changed. It filled with shapes, silhouettes, the outlines of ships. More ships than he had ever seen gathered in one place, more ships than he had believed could exist. What Pluskat was seeing in the darkness was Operation Neptune, the naval component of Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious fleet ever assembled in history. Nearly 7,000 vessels of every type and size were crossing the channel, organized into 5 assault forces, each bound for a different landing beach. The bombardment force alone comprised battleships, monitors, cruisers, and scores of destroyers. Behind them came the hundreds of troop carriers and landing ships, bearing the infantry of the 1st United States Army on the right flank and the British 2nd Army on the left. Overhead, more than 2,000 Allied aircraft had already crossed the Channel during the night, dropping paratroopers of the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions west of Utah Beach and the British 6th Airborne Division east of Sword Beach. The airborne landings had created chaos and confusion far behind the coastline, disrupting communications, seizing bridges and road junctions, and drawing the attention of German commanders toward inland threats while the main force approached from the sea. And at 5:50 in the morning, as the first grey light of dawn began to separate sky from water, the battleships opened fire. The bombardment came in waves with a comprehensiveness the Atlantic Wall had never been designed to absorb. Before the naval guns had fired a single round, the Royal Air Force had put more than 1,000 heavy bombers over the Normandy coast during the night, dropping thousands of tons of high explosives on the coastal batteries and the beach defenses. American heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force followed in the pre-dawn darkness over the assault beaches themselves. The results were mixed. At Pointe du Hoc, the bombing was heavy and sustained. At Longtime, the thick casemate walls absorbed most of what fell directly on them, though the buried communications cables were cut and the immediate approaches were cratered. At the beaches themselves, the bombers over Omaha released their loads on a 30-second delay, intended to avoid hitting the landing craft approaching below, and that delay carried most of the bombs well inland, where they fell harmlessly on farmland and left the German strongpoints intact. Over Utah Beach, medium bombers of the American 9th Air Force flew at lower altitude beneath the cloud deck and achieved much better results, suppressing the defenders around the beach exits. At Utah Beach, Rear Admiral Morton Deyo commanded his bombardment group from the heavy cruiser United States ship Tuscaloosa. When the German batteries at Crisbecq and Saint-Marcouf opened fire on his destroyers before the scheduled start time, Deyo judged the battle already joined and released his ships early. The United States ship Nevada, the old survivor of Pearl Harbor, turned her 10 14-inch guns on the Crisbecq battery and began a systematic assault on its casemates. The battery housed 3 210mm naval guns, among the heaviest pieces of artillery on the entire Normandy coast, capable of throwing a shell more than 18 miles. Naval gunfire from Nevada and supporting cruisers eventually disrupted the battery's fire control and damaged its casemates, though the garrison under Walter Olmsson refused to abandon the position and held out in the damaged concrete for nearly a week, requiring a sustained ground assault to finally clear it. Above Utah Beach itself, the combined aerial and naval bombardment had done substantial work. When the first troops of the 4th Infantry Division landed at 6:30 in the morning, the defenders of the nearest strongpoint had been so thoroughly concussed and disorganized by the bombardment that their resistance collapsed quickly. Lieutenant Arthur Janke, commanding Widerstandsnest 5, had been struck down by the bombardment and his garrison was rapidly overrun. Utah Beach was taken for fewer than 200 American casualties, a figure so far below the pre-invasion estimates that planners initially refused to believe the reports coming back. Omaha Beach told a different story entirely. The Omaha bombardment sector was covered by the Texas and the Arkansas, supported by cruisers and a screen of destroyers. The naval gunfire began at 5:50 and lifted at around 6:25, less than 40 minutes before the first landing craft touched the sand. The heavy bombers over Omaha had missed virtually everything. The specialized armored swimming tanks designed to lead the assault had been launched too far offshore in heavy seas, and most of them sank before reaching shore, taking their crews with them. Naval fire, directed at map coordinates because the shore fire control parties had not yet landed, largely failed to suppress the German machine gun positions built into the bluffs at angles that made them almost impossible to hit from vessels offshore. And critically, Allied intelligence had learned that the 352nd Infantry Division, a full-strength experienced field division, far superior to the static garrison troops originally expected there, had been repositioned into the Omaha sector, but this information reached frontline commanders too late to alter the assault plan. When the ramps went down on the first wave at Omaha, the Atlantic Wall was very much alive and firing. At Widerstandsnest 62, Heinrich Severloh opened fire with his machine gun at the command of Lieutenant Frerking the moment the first landing craft dropped their ramps at around 6:30. He would fire until his gun barrels burned, and he was forced to switch to his 2 carabiner rifles to continue. He later reported firing approximately 13,500 rounds of machine gun ammunition over 9 hours of fighting. The precise number of Americans he killed remains disputed among historians. In his memoir, published decades after the war, Severloh claimed to have killed at least 1,000 men, and possibly more than 2,000, but analysts who have studied the full casualty record of Omaha Beach treat that figure with great skepticism. What is not in doubt is that Severloh fired from one of the most lethal positions on the entire beach, and did so for the full length of the landing. He was still alive in 2006, 62 years after the battle, and in those years he sought out survivors of Omaha Beach, wrote letters to them, received letters back, and carried what his hands had done in a way that never left him. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Bernhard Freking, was shot and killed while attempting to withdraw from the position later that day. Franz Gockel, a younger soldier in the same strongpoint, survived both the battle and the war, eventually writing a memoir about his experience titled The Gate to Hell. He described the naval bombardment in the hours before the landing as a physical force that stripped a man of his sense of himself. The sound, he wrote, did not come through the ears. It came through the bones. When a heavy shell struck the bluff above the bunker, the entire earth lifted and fell, and dust poured through every crack, and men clung to one another in the dark. And then there was silence, and then the whistle of the next one coming. By 8 in the morning at Omaha, the situation was so desperate that General Omar Bradley, watching from aboard the cruiser United States ship Augusta offshore, he was seriously considering withdrawing the entire Omaha force and redirecting follow-on troops to the flanks. The bodies of American soldiers were piling up at the waterline where the surf had carried them. Entire companies had been cut apart in the water and on the sand. The bluffs above the beach, from which German machine guns fired down the full length of the shore, had not been silenced by the preparatory bombardment. The plan was failing. What saved the day was not the plan. What saved it was the American destroyers. Around 8 in the morning, with the situation ashore clearly catastrophic and most shore fire control teams dead or separated from their equipment, the destroyer skippers of the Allied naval forces made a collective decision. Captain Harry Sanders led his ships in toward the beach at Omaha with deliberate disregard for depth restrictions and the standing order to preserve 50% of their ammunition for anti-submarine defense. The United States ship Frankfurt pushed to within what her veterans later described as 400 yards of the beach, close enough that her crew could see individual German soldiers in the embrasures of the clifftop bunkers above. The United States ship Carmick, the United States ship McCook, the United States ship Emmons, the United States ship Doyle, the United States ship Harding, and the United States ship Satterlee, along with British destroyers of the Hunt class including His Majesty's ships Talibont, Melbrake, and Tanatside, formed a firing line so close to shore that German infantry fired rifles and machine guns at their hulls. The Carmick alone fired more than 1,100 5-inch rounds in roughly 90 minutes. The McCook knocked a German gun clean from its clifftop mount. By noon, the fire from the bluffs had been suppressed enough for small groups of Americans to begin moving up the draws, clearing positions one bunker and one trench at a time. That afternoon, General Leonard Guerreau of the 5th Corps sent a signal from the beach to General Bradley aboard the Augusta. It read, in full, "Thank God for the United States Navy." On the British and Canadian beaches to the east, the later tidal schedule gave the bombardment force nearly 2 full hours to work before the infantry landed. The 15-inch shells of His Majesty's ship Warspite and His Majesty's ship Ramillies, each projectile weighing nearly a ton, dismantled casemates built with optimism to resist them. At Longtime, the 4 150mm guns opened fire at 6:05 in the morning against Allied command ships, forcing the headquarters vessel His Majesty's ship Bulolo to withdraw from her position. His Majesty's ship Ajax and His Majesty's ship Argonaut closed the range and fired a combined total of 179 rounds into the battery from relatively close range. 2 of those rounds entered directly through the gun embrasures, destroying the crews inside. 2 of the 4 casemates went silent. The remaining 2 resumed firing later in the day and had to be engaged again by the French cruisers Georges Legs and Montcalm, and then by the aging Arkansas. The last of the Longtime guns fired its final round sometime in the late afternoon, having fired on the invasion fleet for hours without sinking a single vessel, and having confirmed through its entire engagement a fundamental truth about fixed coastal artillery against a properly concentrated naval force. The question that German commanders and historians have examined ever since is a direct one. How did all of that concrete, all of that steel, all of those years of construction, all of those hundreds of thousands of workers and billions of Reichsmarks fail to hold the coast for a single day? The answers are layered, and each one points toward a different kind of failure that even more resources could not have corrected. The first failure was geographic, rooted entirely in deception. The Atlantic Wall was always thickest and most complete at Pas-de-Calais, because German intelligence was absolutely convinced the main Allied blow would fall at the narrowest crossing point. That conviction had been carefully cultivated by the Allies through Operation Fortitude, one of the most elaborate deception campaigns in the history of modern warfare. The plan was developed by Allied deception planners, including Noel Wild at Schaeff and the London Controlling Section under John Bevan, and it created an entirely fictional formation called the 1st United States Army Group. Supposedly commanded by General George Patton, the Allied commander, the German High Command, feared and respected most. Dummy tanks and vehicles were positioned in southeast England, where German reconnaissance aircraft could photograph them. Dummy landing craft sat in Thames estuary harbours. A carefully managed network of double agents fed fabricated intelligence to German handlers, most importantly the Spaniard Juan Pujol Garcia, who operated under the British codename Garbo and was trusted implicitly by German intelligence. Even after the Normandy landings had clearly begun on June 6th, Hitler continued to believe for critical weeks that they were a large-scale diversion, and the real, main Allied blow was still coming across the Strait of Dover at Pas-de-Calais. He held the powerful 15th Army there, waiting for an attack that never materialized, while the actual battle was decided 80 miles to the west, in terrain the 15th Army might have transformed. The second failure was structural, and its consequences played out in the hours after the landings began. Hitler had retained personal control over the most powerful armoured formations available to the Western defences. When word of the landings reached the Berghof on the morning of June 6th, Hitler's staff did not wake him. He had gone to bed late and was well known to become explosively enraged when disturbed. The generals and aides waited. Hitler rose at his customary late hour, received briefings, had visitors for lunch, and finally authorized the release of the armoured reserve in the early afternoon. The window Rommel had described as the decisive 24 hours had closed. The panzers moved toward Normandy into a sky controlled entirely by Allied fighter bombers that attacked anything moving on the roads in daylight. They crept forward at night, on cratered roads, at a fraction of the speed a counterattack required. The armoured blow that was supposed to drive the Allies back into the sea before they could consolidate, a beachhead arrived in pieces over days, and was absorbed. The third failure was fundamental and went beyond any particular decision or any particular commander. Fixed fortifications depend on a correct assumption about where the enemy will attack, at what state of the tide, in what weather, through what gap in the defences. When that assumption is wrong, the defence has already failed before the shooting starts. The casemates at Longnes-sur-Mer were oriented to fire along the beach flanks, tactically sound against infantry landing from the front, but leaving them vulnerable to direct fire from seaward, where the Ajax positioned herself with devastating effect. The strong points at Omaha were designed to engage infantry advancing across the sand, but had limited ability to engage the destroyers that eventually pulled alongside and neutralized them from unexpected angles. The observation posts and fire control systems that made coastal guns effective were far more fragile than the guns themselves. Sever the telephone cable, blind the observer, concuss the gun crew with the overpressure from a near miss, and the most massively built casemate becomes a concrete tomb rather than a fighting position. A fleet of cruisers and battleships that can choose its range, its angle, and its point of concentration at will is a fundamentally different opponent than the static installation built to defeat a known attack from a known direction. History had offered this lesson before, in blood. In April 1915, a combined British and French fleet had tried to force the Dardanelles and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war by naval power alone. They had attacked without adequate minesweeping, without meaningful air power, without any coordinated ground assault to take the shore guns from behind. The French battleship Bouvet hit a mine and capsized in less than 2 minutes, taking more than 600 men with her. The British battleships Irresistible and Ocean were lost the same afternoon. The lesson drawn from Gallipoli for the next 2 decades was that ships could not defeat shore artillery, But that lesson was incomplete, because it was drawn from an operation that used warships in isolation. It was not drawn from an operation like Normandy, which combined naval bombardment with air power, with airborne assault securing the flanks, with specialized armor for the beaches, with overwhelming material concentration, and with a deception plan that put the defenders in the wrong place on the wrong day. The lesson of Gallipoli applied to a different kind of operation. Normandy changed the lesson entirely. In August 1942, the Dieppe raid had demonstrated what happened when an amphibious assault went in without adequate naval fire support. More than 6,000 mostly Canadian troops landed at the French port of Dieppe without the weight of bombardment the position required, without the specialized armor that could have cleared the beach obstacles, and without the element of surprise. Within 9 hours, nearly 3,500 of them had been killed, wounded, or captured. The Allies studied Dieppe with exhaustive care and drew conclusions from it that shaped every aspect of what happened on June 6, 1944. They chose open beaches rather than defended ports. They designed and produced the remarkable collection of specialized armored vehicles the British called Hobart's Funnies, including tanks that could flail mines, lay fascines across obstacles, and throw explosive charges at bunker walls. They demanded naval gunfire support on a scale that dwarfed anything tried before. And they planned the operation in layers, with deception, with airborne assault, with artificial harbours called mulberry harbours, towed across the channel in sections and assembled offshore to sustain the force, even without a captured port. The distance between Dieppe and Normandy was the distance between an improvised assault and a fully orchestrated combined arms operation. The Atlantic Wall was built to defeat the former. It met the latter. There is also the lesson of Singapore, which fell to Japanese forces in February 1942. The island's coastal guns, including heavy 15-inch naval rifles, could traverse landward, and several batteries did fire against Japanese troops crossing the Johor Strait from Malaya. But they had been equipped with armor-piercing shells designed to penetrate warship steel, not the high-explosive rounds needed to kill infantry in open ground. The shells buried themselves and produced craters but caused few casualties. The fire control systems were designed for adjusting on moving ships at sea, not for directing fire onto troops dispersed in jungle. Everything about those fortifications had been optimized for a threat from the ocean. When the threat arrived overland instead, the guns could be pointed in the right direction, but they could not fight the right battle. The Atlantic Wall carried the same structural limitation. A fortification built to destroy one kind of attack does not automatically survive a different one. In the Pacific, the Marine Corps had been learning the same equation at a terrible cost. At Tarawa Atoll in November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division landed on Betio Island after a pre-landing bombardment of only about 3 hours. Japanese defenders emerged from their coral-reinforced bunkers the moment the ships ceased fire and were ready and waiting when the first wave came ashore. 3/4 of the first wave became casualties. Nearly 1,000 Americans died, taking an island barely 2 miles long. The Navy absorbed that lesson completely. At Kwajalein in February 1944, the bombardment was longer and heavier, and Marine losses fell by more than 2/3. By the time the planners of Neptune finalized their fire support schedules, the relationship between naval bombardment weight and ground casualties was reasonably well understood. Where the formula was applied with full weight, as at Utah and on the British and Canadian beaches, it worked. Where it was compressed, or where the bombing was inaccurate, as at Omaha Beach, the deficit was paid for in blood by the infantry. The collapse of the Atlantic Wall changed the strategic situation in the West with a speed that surprised even the Allies. Within a week of June 6th, the 5 separate Allied beachheads had been joined into a continuous front. Within 3 weeks, the American 7th Corps had cut across the Cotentin Peninsula and invested Cherbourg, though the German garrison demolished the port facilities before surrendering on June 27, 1944. Rommel's reports to Hitler grew darker with every passing week. On July 15th, he sent a report telling Hitler directly that the unequal struggle was nearing its end, that German troops were fighting heroically but being bled dry, and that a breaking point was approaching. Hitler sent orders to hold. 2 days later, on July 17, 1944, Royal Air Force fighters strafed Rommel's staff car near the village of Sainte-Foy de Montgomery. On the road between Livarot and Vimoutiers, throwing him from the vehicle with severe skull fractures. He survived the injuries, only to be implicated in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler. On October 14, 1944, two officers arrived at his home in Hurlingen with a choice. He could take poison and be given a state funeral with his family protected, or he could face trial before a people's court and accept the consequences for everyone connected to him. He took the cyanide. He was 52 years old. By the autumn of 1944, the consequences of June 6th were irreversible. Operation Cobra broke the German line at Severloh on July 25th. The German 7th Army was shattered and largely destroyed in the Falaise pocket in August. Paris was liberated on August 25th. By September, Allied forces stood at the German border itself. The Atlantic Wall was now simply a series of empty concrete fortifications standing abandoned far behind the front, relics of a strategic failure. The myth Goebbels had built around the wall had collapsed along with its defences. For the German public, filtered through the censorship and propaganda still available to the regime, the news of what had happened on June 6th could not be entirely suppressed. The wall had failed. The impregnable fortress had been breached in a morning. Everyone who heard that understood what it meant about everything else. Today, along the Normandy coast, the physical remnants of the Atlantic Wall serve a purpose their builders never intended. They have become places of memory. At Pointe du Hoc, administered by the American Battle Monuments Commission, the clifftop looks almost exactly as it did on the afternoon of June 6, 1944. The craters from naval gunfire and Allied bombing are still there, grass-lined now, some of them deep enough to stand in without being seen over the rim. The concrete observation bunker at the cliff's edge, from which the garrison once scanned the English Channel, still stands, marked by shrapnel scars. A granite monument, shaped like a ranger's dagger driven into the earth, commemorates the men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion who scaled those cliffs on ropes under fire, having been told the guns they were attacking were loaded and ready. The guns were not there. The Rangers took the position anyway. 8 kilometers to the east, the battery at Longueuil-sur-Mer is the only major German coastal battery in Normandy where the original guns remain in their casemates. All 4 of the 150mm naval rifles are still there, in the concrete structures that once held them. One barrel is shattered where a direct hit entered through the gun embrasure and destroyed the weapon and its crew. The other 3 are scarred but intact, still pointing out to sea across the same water where the Ajax and Argonaut once maneuvered. The fire control bunker on the cliff's edge stands open to the sky, its instruments long gone, its view of the channel unchanged. The French government designated the battery a historic monument in 2001. There is no fence. Visitors walk freely through the casemates and out to the clifftop bunker. On a clear day, standing in that fire control position and looking out at the English Channel, one can see nearly to the horizon. One tries to imagine that horizon full of grey warships in the early light of June 6, 1944. One can almost do it. Above Omaha Beach, on the bluffs where Heinrich Severloh kept his machine gun firing for 9 hours, lies the Normandy American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer. It covers 172.5 acres, given by France to the United States in perpetuity. Within its rows of white marble crosses and stars of David rest 9,389 American war dead. The walls of the missing bear the names of 1,557 more. More than 1 million visitors come each year. Standing at the cemetery's edge and looking down at the beach below, one sees the same geography that Heinrich Severloh looked at from his machine gun position, and that the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions looked at from their landing craft as the ramps went down. The sand, the long exposed approach, the bluffs rising above the beach exit draws. It is very quiet there. What the story of the Atlantic Wall ultimately asks of anyone who examines it carefully is not a question about engineering. It is a question about the limits of force organized by fear. The Germans built the largest coastal fortification in history and called it impregnable. They conscripted the labor of occupied peoples to raise it and dressed it in propaganda. And the assumptions built into every meter of that concrete, that they knew where the blow would come, that fixed guns could dominate a mobile fleet, that holding a line was more decisive than the ability to mass and maneuver, were all wrong in ways that no thickness of concrete could correct. Deception made the geography wrong. Naval firepower exposed every assumption about fixed installations, and the command structure Hitler imposed made the one thing that might have compensated for everything else: a rapid armoured counterattack in the first hours, physically impossible to execute. The men who crossed those beaches on June 6, 1944, were not invincible. They were young and frightened, and many of them died in the first minutes. The soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division who landed on Omaha had their plan destroyed almost the instant they arrived. What they did next, working in small groups up the draws without orders and without coordinated support, was the product of something concrete cannot hold, and no defensive directive can manufacture. It was the product of individuals who understood what failure meant, and who found, in that understanding, the will to keep moving. And it was the product of destroyer captains who brought their ships dangerously close to a beach, still under fire, and chose accuracy over safety, and of naval planners who had learned from every failure that preceded Normandy and built those lessons into the bombardment that made Utah possible and the close-in fire that eventually made Omaha survivable. The United States ship Nevada had been left partially sunk at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. She was raised from the mud, repaired, refitted, and sailed to France. When she fired her 10 14-inch guns at the Crisbecq battery on the morning of June 6, 1944, she completed an arc that began in smoke and catastrophe and ended in overwhelming, purposeful, coordinated power. That arc is what the Atlantic Wall had been built to prevent. The Germans poured 17 million cubic meters of concrete to stop it. It came across the water anyway. The coast of Normandy is quiet now. The guns at Long-sur-Mer point at an empty sea. The craters at Pointe du Hoc soften at the edges with each passing decade. The marble rows at Colleville-sur-Mer stand through the seasons, through the anniversaries, through the years in which the last men and women with a personal memory of that day have grown very old. The obligation carried forward by those who inherit this history is not to celebrate the violence that happened there, however necessary it was. It is to understand clearly what the construction of the Atlantic Wall reveals about a regime that ruled by compulsion and built by forced labor, and what its breach reveals about what people are capable of when they understand what is at stake, and are given, however imperfectly, the tools and the leadership and the preparation to act on that understanding. A wall built on wrong assumptions does not become sound with more concrete. And a cause defended by people who have chosen it, even at the cost that Omaha made plain in the first light of June 6, 1944, does not break on concrete. It climbs it and goes through and does not stop.